Okay, so last time we started a new topic which is going to be canonical problems in distributed systems, whole slew of problems we will study and solutions for it. So the first one we studied last time was physical clocks and clock synchronization. How do you ensure that machines that are part of a distributed systems can synchronize their clock so that the clocks are all within a small error tolerance of one another. That way, if you use these local clocks to timestamp events, you can compare across machines and reason about what order they happen. And I said the main problem was any clock synchronization algorithm will have some accuracy. If two events occur very close to one another, in particular the time distance between the two events is less than the accuracy of the clock synchronization algorithm, then all bets are off in terms of comparing the timestamps and reasoning about it. So in NTP, for instance, we have 50 millisecond or so, 10 to 50 millisecond accuracy. So if you have two events that are actually happening within 1 millisecond of one another, given that the clock itself may be off by as much as 50 millisecond, comparing those timestamps doesn't let you say anything. Okay, so we said how do we get, so the corollary to that observation is there is no such thing as a global clock. Global clock is a set of clocks that are perfectly synchronized with one another. So you will not have that scenario. So either you have to live with the error tolerances or you have to get away from clock synchronization and reason about event ordering through some other means. Okay, that is what brought us to this notion of logical clocks. So we said basically what we are trying to do in many cases is not worry about what time the event happened. In certain applications, the timing of events may have importance, like streaming applications, you need a frame to arrive every 33 milliseconds and so on. So the timing may be important. But in many other applications, you are simply using timestamp as a mechanism to agree on the ordering of events, which event happened before which other event. So we said, why can we not solve that problem directly without having to go through physical clocks? So we said we will assume that clocks now are not even synchronized with one another. Okay, so we will not use physical clocks. Instead, we will use some other means to determine the order in which events happen. And I said what we really want is a way to define a total ordering of all the events. Total ordering says every event is ordered with respect to every other event on any machine. Okay, if you get that, then you are going to be able to always take any two events and reason about the ordering. Okay? But we said we'll start simple and see how we can even derive any order, let alone a total order. So we said the following observations are true. On any given machine, events can be ordered. So within a process, you can order events in the order in which the process executes those events. So if you're simply ordering print statements, say, okay, depending on the order in which the print statements are being executed, you can say this statement was printed before this other statement. It could be any event. It doesn't have to be print statement. It could be reading something from a file. So when a packet arrived over a network, when you printed something, or when you received a request, whatever the event is that is important to that application, within a single process, you can always define the ordering of events. That's the order in which the process executes those events. Okay? We'll say no global clock, local clocks are unsynchronized. So even that is the case, now we want to derive some order across processes. And we said the main observation we are going to use is message send and message receive. Across processes, okay, the simple observation is a message has to be sent before it is received. Okay? The send, remember now, the send is happening on one machine, the receipt is happening on some other machine because the message is traversing a network. But because a message cannot be received before it's sent, that doesn't make any sense. Now you can say that the send on this machine has to have happened before the receipt on that machine. Okay? So we'll use that property to then say all events within a process before the send will obviously be happened before the send. All events on the receiving machine after the receive would have happened after that receive. So now you can order events across processes simply because a process happened to exchange a message. Okay, that's the observation we are going to make. I'll show you some pictures in just a moment. Okay. So any questions about that? We are going to build from there and derive some ways to order events using the notion of logical clocks. Okay? Very straightforward idea. We basically say within a process you can order events. Across processes, when you exchange messages, the send has to have happened before receipt, so we are going to use that property. Is that clear? So now I will make it a little more formal. So we'll say if A and B are any two events, and in particular events within the same process, and A executed before B. Event A was executed before event B, then it should be clear that A happened before B. This arrow is what is referred to as a happened before relationship. So if you see A arrow B, that means A has happened before B. Okay, within a process A has executed before B, so it should be clear that A has happened before B. Okay? So now if A represents the sending of a message, A is an event, that's a message sent. B is an event, that's a message received. Then we said that A has again happened before B for these two particular events. Because we said send has to have happened before receipt. It doesn't matter which process did the send, which process did the receive. The message will take a finite time to propagate. So always the send happens before the receipt. Okay? Messages cannot be sent and received instantaneously. Okay? So these are the only two properties we need. Within a process, A executes before B, then A happens before B. Across processes, if A is the send of a message and B is the receipt of a message, then A happens before B again. And those two things should be almost obvious. Okay, and then we say this relationship is transitive. Right? Given any three events A, B, C, if you know that A has happened before B and B has happened before C, that will imply that A has happened before C. A simple transitive property. Okay. So that's the basically whatever I described intuitively. This is a formal way of representing events and the happened before relationship. So we say locally you order it, send and receive, you order it and make it transitive. And then the most important last point is the relationship is undefined across processes that do not exchange messages. There are two processes that are executing independently. Within those processes you can order events. But since they don't exchange any messages, there is nothing to order events between them because they are independent processes. Okay, so we'll say if you take an event A in process 1 and event B in process 2, they don't exchange messages, you cannot say which event happened before which event. It's undefined. Okay? There is no information that's available to us based on these two properties to order those events. Okay? So we'll say that process relationship is undefined when processes don't exchange messages. So what that says is we get a partial ordering. We will not get a total ordering, which is what we wanted, but we got a partial ordering nevertheless. Okay? Is that clear what the happened before relationship is? So now, given the happened before relationship, what we want is a time-stamping algorithm that will allow us to timestamp an event and then look at the timestamp and say something about the event. Okay? Because this is just an observation. Okay? What you want is just as in a clock synchronization algorithm, you took a real clock and you timestamp an event and then you looked at those two and said what happened between these two events. You want the same thing without any notion of a real clock. We are going to use what is referred to as a logical clock. Okay? In particular, we are going to first want an algorithm that gives us this property. Okay? If A and B are two events and you know that A happened before B, then you want a time-stamping algorithm that will basically say that the clock value of A is strictly less than the clock value of B. Okay? So you want an algorithm, if A and B are ordered by the happened before relationship, then the clock time-stamping algorithm should assign a clock value or a timestamp for A which is strictly less than timestamp of B. That should follow. Okay? And if A and B are concurrent, which means they're independent events in processes that are not exchanging messages, we don't care what values the timestamping algorithm has. So it can be equal, less than, greater than. Because they're independent, we are not going to worry about the timestamp. Okay, only when you can order them, you want that property to be true. Okay. So now question is, how do you design such a time stamping algorithm? We'll say that it's actually very straightforward. Okay, but is the problem clear? Okay, if you have two events such that A happened before B, you want a time stamping algorithm that assigns timestamps or clock values, as we'll call them. That C of A is a clock value assigned to event A, such that the clock value of A is less than clock value. Okay, so the algorithm is very straightforward. I'm going to actually draw a picture just to show you how it works. Okay, let's have this timeline, process A, let's not call it A and B have events, call it process P1 and P2. two processes. Okay? We can have any number, it doesn't matter. There's no limit on the number of messages. Okay? So each process is going to maintain an integer, which we will refer to as a logical clock. Okay? Now, unlike a physical clock that ticks every second, a logical clock will tick every event. Okay? Because we don't care about real time anymore, we only care about events. So if there are two events within process P1, the logical clock will be ticked after every event that you care about. What these events are is left to the process. Only events that matter you will actually cause the clock to tick. Okay? Maybe you want to only look at network or request receipts. Okay? So every time a request is received, you will tick. You may want to care about interrupt. So every time an interrupt occurs, so you define what events are of interest in this system or application. Every time an event occurs, so every process is going to maintain a logical clock. Okay? L, it's simply an integer, you start with 0. Every time an event occurs, you tick the clock. Okay? So what that says is every time an event occurs locally, you increment your logical clock. Okay? So basically, these are all local events, so you just do this. And then this process will have its own clock, which will be incremented on every local event. Okay? So now let's say process P1 is going to send a message to process P2. Okay, what we will do now is whenever you send a message, you piggyback your clock with the message. So you have the message has some data being sent, but you also send your clock value. Okay, so basically, let's say, we'll just call it I and J for simplicity. Okay, so so this is a send, this is a receive. Okay, so when you send the message, you are going to, in addition to the message, you are going to piggyback your clock value. Okay, and now let's say there's another clock here which is J at this point in time. It's also incrementing at every local event. So what you will do now is for this message, this event here, the receipt event, what you will do is you will take the max of the two clock values. Okay, so you say max of whatever clock has come on the message, your local clock plus 1. Okay. So you will increment it. But you won't increment your local clock, you will take the max of the two clocks and increment that one. Okay? Is that clear? So that's basically what's being said here. When I sends a message to J, piggyback the local clock value. When you receive, you basically do, if your clock is already greater than the other clock, you increment, otherwise you do the max. Okay? Yes?
How do you define an event?
How do you define an event? Event is anything that the processes or the system is interested in. Okay? It doesn't matter what the event is. You can say event is an instruction. Then every instruction you execute, assembly instruction, you increment a clock. You could say event is only requests that are received or sent. Then you increment it. Event could be I print something onto the screen. And you define for that application what the events are, because you want to reason about events to decide what order they happen. Okay, so you decide what are these events that one cares about, and those are the events on which you will increment. Okay? What that is from the perspective of the algorithm, not material. Every event you are going to increment. That's all that you care about. Okay, what the event is up to the application. Okay, is that clear? Okay. So locally you increment, okay, and then when you send a message, you piggyback your clock, and when you receive a message, you take the max of the two clocks and you increment that value. Okay. Now the claim is just by doing this is a timestamping algorithm, as you can see. Okay, locally you incremented and timestamped every event. Okay, whenever you send, you also done the same thing, but you try to do the max. Okay, so now you can ask the question: do you actually get the property we want to start? If A happened before B, then timestamp of A should be less than timestamp of B. So now you can say either these are events within a process or across processes. So let's take two events within a process. Okay, I'm just going to circle them with some colors. So let's take the pink event and the blue event within a process. Okay. Clearly the pink event has happened before the blue event because these are local events. Okay. This is the timeline. Right. So this event is executed before that event. That's the order in which events are actually being executed in the process. Okay, can you now say that timestamp assigned to the pink is less than the timestamp assigned to the blue? It should be, because whenever you have a local event, you're incrementing. So if this event is several events after you have incremented the clock, so the timestamp assigned here has to be less than the timestamp assigned there. Okay, because local events you just increment. Okay. So for any two local events, if A happened before B, then they will know that the timestamp. So that property is true if there are two local events. Okay. Let me now put the event here. Now there's a pink event in process P1, blue event in process P2. Okay. First of all, you can ask, did this event happen before that event? Should be yes, okay, because locally this event has preceded the send. Okay, and this is timeline, so this event has happened before this event. When process P2, the receive precedes the blue because that's the local order of execution. Okay. Send always happens before the receipt. Fundamental property of messages. You can't receive a message before it was sent. Now apply transitivity. Red event happened before the send happened before the receipt happened before the blue event. We said the event, this is clearly a transitive property. So you should know that this red event has now happened before the blue event. Okay, okay, is that clear? Okay. So now if this event has actually happened before that event, does our timestamping algorithm also work? Will it always guarantee that the integer value assigned to the red event will be strictly less than the integer value assigned to the blue event?
Only in this case, like the message is received and then there is this event which we are interested in.
Yeah, so this is the scenario, there's a send and a receive. So it should be clear that the integer value assigned to the red event is less than the send. That part is clear. Now when you send, you are piggybacking your local clock, okay? And here you are doing the max of your local clock and the clock that has arrived, and you are doing +1. Okay? So that means that the integer value of the send has to be smaller than the receipt because it's the max of I and j +1. So this will always be greater than, because this will at least be I +1. Okay, maybe even more than I +1 if j is already greater. So the send will have a value that is strictly less than the receipt. Okay, now these are two local events, so this clock would have ticked at least one between this receipt and the blue. Okay. So that should tell you that the red has to be, the clock value of red has to be less than the clock value of blue. Okay. Is that clear? Okay. So we now I just gave you an informal proof. It says for local events, the clock values will also always follow that property. If A happened before B, clock value of A is less than. Across processes, if A happened before B, as we saw in the transitive case, the clock values are going to be also assigned in monotonically increasing order, or strictly increasing order. Okay. Last property, if we want to ask, say we have a red event here and a blue event here. Okay. What is the ordering of those events? What are the clock values assigned to those events? Yes. No.
We can't reason about that because there's no way of like telling and ordering based on what we just learned.
Okay, so point being made is we can't reason about this event. All we can say is the red event happened after the send, the blue event happened after the receipt, but there is no way to actually do anything here. Okay. So from the perspective of the algorithm, these are referred as concurrent or independent event. There is no message exchange that allows you to order the red event with respect to the blue. Okay. So in this case, whatever clock value you are assigned, it doesn't matter because there is no, the relationship is undefined between those two events. Okay. Same would be true if you had something like this. Okay. An event after the send and before the receive. The only thing you can order is what you have along the blue line here. All of these events have happened before the send, all of those events have happened after the receive. So everything along that blue line you can say happened before relationship holds and the clock values will be according to it. Okay, anything after the send and before the receipt or before the send and before the receipt are all independent. Okay, there is no message exchange there. So you can't actually define the happened before relationship, so the clock value is not going to be telling you anything. Okay, so there's a small picture here that shows exactly what I have here. This is the picture without, this is, I should also mention by the way, this logical clock, this algorithm is referred to as logical clocks, okay, because they're not physical clock. Each of those integer values are logical clock. They are also referred to as Lamport's clock because they were designed or proposed rather by Leslie Lamport, same guy who designed LaTeX, for those of you who know what LaTeX is. Okay, so they are referred to as Lamport's clocks or logical clocks. Okay, so that's just the name that is usually used to refer to them. Okay, so here is the Lamport logical clock algorithm working. Okay, so here you see three processes, P1, P2, P3. They are exchanging some messages. So the same idea holds. Always the send precedes the receipt. So anything before the send and anything after the receipt between those two processes is going to hold. Okay. In addition, you should realize that because the relationship is transitive, you can actually order in certain cases events between two processes even though they have not directly exchanged messages, but there's an indirect message exchange. So for instance, P1 sends message M1 to P2. Okay. P2 sends message M2 to P3. P1 and P3 have not directly exchanged any messages. Okay. Yet, so because this send precedes that receive and that send precedes that receipt, you can order all events after the receipt here and all events before the send there because of transitivity. Okay. So you do not need direct message exchange. Even if the messages goes through some other processes, the clock values are going to propagate that way. Okay. That's something to keep in mind. Okay. If there is neither a direct nor an indirect exchange, all bets are off. Then you can't order those events. Okay. Now what this is showing, there are two pictures here. This is showing just how the clock values are incremented locally, but no Lamport's clock algorithm is in use. Okay, and it's showing you certain scenarios where, let's say, those are events. They are not shown all the events. That's why you see the clock value jumping. Okay, but nevertheless, you see message M3 here. The send has a clock value of 60. Okay? When the message is received, the local clock has only advanced to 56. There are only 56 events have happened. Okay, if you did not use Lamport's clock algorithm, you'll see now this receipt has a timestamp of 56. The send has a timestamp of 60. The send has a higher timestamp. Okay. This is why it won't work unless you take the max of the two. Okay. Here you have the same scenario where you piggyback the clock value. You take a max of 60 and 56 and you increment it by 1, which is why you adjusted your clock value to 61. So now you see that the send will have a smaller timestamp than the receipt. This is why you need to take the max, because if the clock has not advanced far enough, there are fewer events, then you will not get the property you want. Okay. Same is true for message M4. Here the send has a 64 timestamp. The local timestamp here is only 54 and the receipt has. If you did not take the max again, your receipt will have a lower timestamp, which is why you again send, here because the adjustment has happened, this is advanced to 69. So you send 69, you take a max of 69 and 54 and you add 1, which is why the receipt got 70 there. So if you do Lamport's clock, then you will see the property you want will actually hold. Yes, question?
There will be no use of the physical clock in this the entire scenario, whichever you are.
Yes. So in this case, physical clocks are not being used at all. You are simply using an integer as a logical clock to reason about event ordering. Okay, what happened to physical clocks is not important. The clocks could be unsynchronized in this case. Or even if they're synchronized, you're not using or relying on physical clocks. You're simply using an integer, and with the simple property or observation that when processes exchange messages, the send and the receipt are ordered. This allows you to order events across processes. Okay. Any questions here?
The second figure, shouldn't the message M1 is passed?
Yes.
So shouldn't 16 become 17 because max of 6 and 16 is 16 plus 1?
Okay. So question is M1, why is that not incrementing the clock? Is that what this is? So this is showing the clock value that was assigned to this after the receipt happened. So presumably here the clock had advanced to 15. The clock that came from the message was 6. So you take max of 6 plus 15 plus 1. So the what got assigned is 16. least that's what is being shown. Technically it works even if you don't do +1, even with the max it works, but we just do +1 just to reason about it better. Yes?
Is there a maximal value for the loaded block?
Is what?
The maximal value, like you cannot always increase. Cannot be
What is the
infinite.
maximum value of the clock? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So this is an integer. Okay, the integer ticks after every event. There is no maximum value that
So
you
if
don't
this
care
is-
about how many events are happening. You just ticking the clock. What's the question again? I didn't follow
Is
your
it-
question.
This cannot be infinite if the system always runs.
It cannot be infinite. It can keep increasing. Depends on how many events have happened. This is simply an integer, so the integer can always increase, right? Integers have no limit. I don't understand what you're asking.
I assume it will zeroize after the process ending.
Repeat your question, it's what?
I mean, every time you change a process, you want to initialize the.
Whenever you start a process, you start with the clock of 0. As long as the process runs, you keep incrementing. When the process receives a message, you take the clock value of the message that came, your local clock max is the 2 plus 1. Okay, so what's the question? I'm not following. Are you saying something about integer cannot be, what do you mean by integer
Yeah,
cannot be
I
infinite?
mean, if the like integer is defined as a long.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you are asking about machine representation of integer. So you are asking if there are 32-bit integers, then the maximum number of events you can track is 2 to the power 31 because the integer will overflow. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So this algorithm is clearly an abstract algorithm. Here integers are integers. The integers can increment to whatever value you want. In a physical machine where you represent it, clearly the integer representation you have should be able to accommodate all the events that have happened over the lifetime of the process. If this is an infinitely running application that never terminates, eventually your integer on any real machine will overflow. That's the point we are making. That's true that's an implementation issue. Okay, that doesn't matter what the abstract algorithm is. It's an integer. Integers can always increment. So you need to make sure whether you use long or long is a 24-bit, 32-bit, excuse me, or a 64-bit. All of that and how many events you track will depend on the lifetime. In most cases, it's not going to matter. Even 2 to the power 32 is good enough. For 64-bit integers, you will not have enough events to track. That is not a problem. That's a lot of events to before the integer overflows. But we are not worried about the abstract, the implementation of an abstract algorithm. So it's simply an algorithm. So here integers can never overflow because it's an abstract integer. Okay, they can keep ticking. But in implementation, that's an important detail. Yes. Okay. So there is a discussion in the textbook of how you take this Lamport's algorithm, which only involves message exchange between pairs of processes and hence only gives you partial order. He said after the send and after the receipt, those are independent events and things like that. So there are certain events here that you cannot order, so it's a partial order. But the book actually talks about how do you take that algorithm, generalize it and get a real total order. Okay, what happens in real total ordering is in addition to the send and the receipt between two processes, that message is actually broadcast to every other process. Even though that message is not required by the process, you simply send a copy of all the messages to every other process in your system, your n processes in a distributed system. So always multicast out messages. Okay, even though the message is only meant for a certain process, everyone else gets it. So everyone else will take the max of that clock value and increment it upon every message exchange. And as a result of that, you can get total order. Because here, if two processes don't exchange messages, or M3 is not received by P1, you cannot order any events here versus P3. Okay. So the intuitive idea is if you can broadcast every message and simply use Lamport's clock algorithm upon the receipt, okay, you will be able to get message ordering that's totally ordered. Okay. I won't go into the details of why that is the case. If you want to know a little more, you can go and look at the book. And it also gives an example of a banking application where you want to basically have updates on what order events have happened. Because let's say you are withdrawing some money and you are depositing some money, and you are withdrawing, let's say you traveled somewhere to a different say state, and you're withdrawing money, and then there's a local replica of your account there, and there's another master database somewhere else. You want to reason about the event ordering. Okay? Did you overdraw your account before the deposit came, or did the deposit come after? So to do this kind of stuff, you need to do total ordering. Partial ordering may not be enough. Okay? And there's a generalization of it, which I won't go into too many details here. You can go and read it in the book. It's more important that you understand the basic algorithm, not the generalization, okay, which is simply Lamport clocks. So now I'm going to show a different algorithm that picks up from Lamport's clock. It's called vector clocks. Okay? And it gives us a slightly different property. Yeah, in fact, it's a property that we probably care about more than what Lamport's clock actually gives us. Okay, so let me go back to what Lamport's clock actually shows. Okay? Lamport's clock says if A has happened before B, okay, you have the sort of a timing diagram, and you know A has happened before B, and Lamport's clock is time stamping events such as C of A is less than C of B. Okay? What that says is A happened before B implies that the clock value of A is less than clock value of B. Okay? Remember that this implication is going in one direction. Okay? It is not a reverse implication. Okay? What that also says is, we haven't said that if clock value of A is less than clock value of B, that implies that A happened before B. Okay? And that's the property we want, because what we want is a timestamping algorithm that timestamp events. And simply by looking at the events, you want to say what order did they happen. If you want to look at timestamps and say this is the order of event, you want the reverse implication. You want to take two events, look at their timestamp, compare them, and based on whether one is greater than the other, say because your timestamp it this way, A has happened before B. Okay? That's not the case for Lamport's clock. Okay? If basically you take any two timestamps and you compare them, you cannot actually say that A has happened before B. In particular, the problem arises because of independent events here. If I just give you event 30 here and 40 there and say now this clock has, this event has timestamp 30, that event has timestamp 40, look at these two timestamps and tell me which event happened before which other event. You can't say, because in this case you will see that they are actually independent events. So you can't say 40 is greater than 30 and 40 has happened later, because if you actually look at the timing diagram, they are independent events. Okay? So what you really want is a timestamping algorithm that gives you the reverse property. Okay, here we have the forward property, which says if you say A has happened before B, I am guaranteeing you that the timestamp I assign to A will be less than the timestamp I assign to B. It's not saying you take any two timestamp I assigned, compare them and say what has happened with regards to the ordering of events. Okay. So basically in Lamport's clock the reverse is not true. Nothing can be said about the ordering of events by comparing them. What you want is the ability to do exactly that. Okay, so we basically not only had partial ordering, we got the opposite of what we wanted, which is we now want to actually look at the timestamp and say something about the event. That was the whole point of starting this whole exercise. So I'll now show you a generalization of Lamport's clock that will give us this property. And I want to define this other term called causality. Okay, causality basically says that if A has happened before B, A is causally related to B. Okay, there is something called a causal ordering, which is A has caused B or A is causally related to B. Okay. So here is an example of causality. Okay, so you want is if send of A has happened before send of B, you want the messages to be delivered also in the same order. If one send has preceded another send, okay, you don't want out of order receipt. You know, this message was sent before that message. So you also want the receipt to have happened in the same order. This is referred to as causal delivery. Okay? It's a nice property to have. Okay, if you have out of order delivery, then that property won't be true. Any system that gives you that property ensures causal delivery. Okay, for example. So there are many scenarios where you want to use causality to impose some higher level property in the application. In this case, the higher level properties messages are received in the order they are sent. Okay, that's very simple. A has been sent before B, A is received before B. Okay? Whether A and B are messages sent from the same process, or A and B are messages that are sent across processes, but there's a way to have a happened before relationship between them is not important. All we are saying is A has happened, A was sent before B as per the happened before relation. So they are also received in that order. Okay? So what we will now do is a timestamp is mechanism that guarantees us that if timestamp of A is less than timestamp of B, then A should have causally preceded B. A happened before B. Okay? So we will now define such a timestamping algorithm. It works very similarly to Lamport's clock, and now we have a term that is called vector clocks, because now our clock is not a single integer, it's a vector of integers. And let me define the algorithm is here. I'm going to show you the same thing with this. Erase this. Same two processes, P1, P2. So now, rather than having one integer, let's assume your system has n processes. Okay? N could be any finite number. So what we will have is we will have an integer per process. So we will have a vector of clocks, not a single clock. Okay? If you process I, basically the ith entry is your local clock. Okay, it's the same as Lamport's clock. So you have a vector of n integers. If you process I, the ith entry of that vector is your clock. Everything else is what you know about other clocks in the system. That's what it means. Okay? And the algorithm works very similarly. Whenever you have local events, you take your local clock, which is if you have process Pi, okay, whenever your local event, you increment the ith entry. In this case, let's say this is process P0 and P1. Okay? So process P0, whenever there are local event, will increment the first entry of the vector. Okay? Process P1, whenever there are local event, will increment the second entry of its vector. Okay? Because that is its local clock. That's exactly the same as Lamport's clock. Okay? Now, again, you do the same thing. When you send a message, you basically send your local, you send your entire vector. Let's say this is now 1, 0. So you send 1, 0 here. Okay? And when you receive, what you do is you take the max of the two vectors plus 1 for your local clock value. Same algorithm. Okay? What does max of the two vector mean? You take each entry, take the max of the two. Okay, so let's say here the clock had advanced to 0, 2. Okay, here clock value is 1, 0. So what has come is 1, 0 and your 0, 2. Okay? So you take the first entry, take max of 1 and 0 and say now that is 1. Take the second entry, max of 0 and 2 is 2. And then you also increment your local clock, so this one will become 1, 9. Okay? So you do max for a vector, which is you do pairwise max of each entry of the vector, and you take your local clock. Okay, so that's exactly what is said here. Send a message, piggyback entire vector, receipt of a message, take each of the kth entry, okay, take the max, and then you increment the local. Okay, and you are done. That's it. So you just took the Lamport's clock, instead of a clock now you have a vector, and then you just send around vectors when you send messages, and you do max of vectors instead of max of integers. Okay, that's the algorithm. Now I haven't shown you why the reverse property is true, that we will talk about. Okay, but the algorithm I hope is clear what it do. Okay. Now again, let's reason about this the way we reasoned about Lamport's clocks. Okay. Local events, basically you get clocks in increasing order. Okay. Basically from 0, 0 you went to 1, 0. Okay. Clock is ticking. Also you will see that for local events, if this is greater than this, then that has happened. For that you should be clear. Okay. Now across events the same thing. This send and this receipt have increasing order. Okay. Same thing is true here. Because of transitivity, any event here will be greater than any event there. All those properties are true. Okay. So So you are getting everything that Lamport's clock is giving you, but you are getting something more as well. Now, let's ask, what is the vector giving us? Okay, why did we need a vector to begin with? Okay. So the vector is a vector of clocks, where ith entry of that vector is your clock, and any jth entry is the clock of the jth process in the system. Okay. At any point, what this vector is telling you is what is the latest event from any process that you know about and you can order. Okay. So this receipt here, so this clock is saying 1-3. So that says your clock has ticked to 3. That's the second entry. Okay. Now you are also maintaining a entry for the clock of process P0. And what this entry tells you is what is the latest event from that process that you know about. That is clearly event 1. That's the same. And that's what you know about because that's the most recent time you heard a message. Okay. So in some sense, what these clocks are telling you is if you have a vector of n integers, okay, what is it that I know about in the system that I know through any send or receive, whether it's a direct send or an indirect send. Okay. That's the notion of a vector clock. Okay. So rather than just doing a match, you also keep track of what is the latest event you know. Now let's go back and ask, why is this property even true? If I give you any two vectors, can you say that always, if they happened before relationship is true, then you have, or if this is true, vector of A is less than vector of B, then happened before relationship is true. Okay. It should be clear that anything along the red path, this property is going to be true because the clocks are increasing in this order. And you can also see pictorially that this is basically, if this clock is greater than that clock, the happened before relationship is always true. Okay. The problem in Lamport's clock arose because of concurrent events. Okay. Independent event got integer values, which you could of course compare integers, but it didn't tell you anything about event ordering. Okay. So now you can ask the question, let's basically say, do the same thing we did before. Let's take a pink event here, okay, and a blue event here. First of all, looking at the picture, what does this tell us? Are they independent or is there happened before relationship? Some people say independent. Are they independent? Should be, right? Because this has happened after the send. There is no message exchange between them. This is before the receive. Okay. What do you think the vector clocks for those two events will look like? Well, the vector clock here is clearly 0, 2. Okay. Let's say this is the next event after that. So what is the vector clock of that event? 2, 0. 2, 0. Okay. Compare the two timestamps. What are the vectors telling you? Which vector is greater than the other? 0, 2 greater than 2, 0 or 2, 0 greater than 0, 2? Only two answers.
0, 2 less 2, 0.
Sorry, what did you say?
0, 2 less than 2, 0.
Okay. So, there's one answer is 0, 2 is less than 2, 0. Can you believe that? Or disbelieve that? Okay, first you should ask, saying you did tell me what less than means for a vector. Define less than should be your answer, not that try to guess. Okay. So, what does it mean to say Vi is less than Vj? Let's define that, then you can ask that question. Okay. A vector is strictly less than another vector. Every entry of this vector is less than or equal to every entry of that vector, and there's at least one entry that's strictly less than. Okay. That means everything here has to be at least no greater than anything there, and there has to be at least one entry that's less than. That's what we mean by less than. That's the generalization of integer less than. If I say integer I is less than integer j, you know what that means. Okay, always that value has to be less than. So here we are saying every entry of this vector has to be less than or equal to every entry there. There should be at least one entry that should be strictly less than. That's why it's strictly less than, not less than or equal. with that definition of vector less than, what does it tell you about this? Okay. 0 is less than 2. First entry is less than this entry here, but this entry is not less than. Okay. The reverse is also not true. Okay. So what this tells you is this vector is not less than that vector is not less than. So in a vector less than, you may have some entries that are less than, some that are greater than. If you have that, you cannot say that one vector is less than another. So what that says is neither is this vector less than the other or the other way around. So those two events are independent. This is why you got this property. Okay? So in Lamport's clock, you may have two events that are undefined in terms of happened before, but they still have integer values. 30 and 40 in particular have real integer values. So you can actually compare them and say integer 30 is less than integer 40. But that doesn't actually, if you look at the picture, it doesn't tell you anything about the happened before relation. This will never happen in vector clocks. If two events are independent, their vectors will not be comparable by definition of how we have done the vector less than. Is that clear? So you can do any two. You can. There's a way to actually write the proof, but you can just do some. So that's the exercise for some homework. But you should convince yourself just by looking at the picture. So let's take that blue event and a brown event here. Okay, so we can just take let's take that as the brown event. So 1 0 0 2, not comparable. Okay? 0 2 2 0, not comparable. 2 0, let's say you have 1 4 here. Okay, which is the one after the receipt. You compare those two. Those are also independent events. Okay, again, they are not comparable because whenever you have events that are independent, you will see that the vector is giving you some values that are greater and some values that are less. Why is that? Because local event, the local clock is incrementing. This process has not heard from that process after the most recent send. So that value is incremented. So your local clock for that process will always be less than that process's clock. Okay? What P1 knows about P0 will always be somewhat outdated than what P0 knows about itself because it has executed certain more events. So its local clock is at 1. So at least that value would be greater than whatever this process knows after the most recent set. Hence the vectors become such that you cannot compare them anymore. Okay, this is what I said. That's why you keep a vector. That is what is the most recent event I know about this other process. Any event locally that has happened after that most recent event I know about it would have a greater timestamp. And hence that entry would be at least greater than what I know about that process. Making those two events not comparable, which is what you should have because you don't have anything after that send to compare. Okay? That's the intuition about why vector clocks work. Okay? So now what we have is, we have the property we want. Given any two events, take their vectors, compare them. If V of A, V of I is less than V of J, you are guaranteed that A has happened before B. And if they are independent events, the vectors by definition are not comparable because of how it works. Okay? So now we have gotten an event ordering the way we want. Okay? No clock synchronization needed, no physical clock needed. We simply use some integers, we incremented the integers, we send those vectors with messages, and now we can talk about ordering of events even though there are no clocks, actual clocks being used. Okay? Very nice property to have. Now we don't care about whether the clocks are out of sync, none of that matters anymore. Only thing that matters is send precedes the receipt. And we use that property to order. Okay? Is that clear? What vector clocks gives, what Lamport's clock do? Yes.
I'm a bit confused actually. We can't order the blue event and the pink event, and the same was the thing in the Lamport clock. So
Yes. Okay. So there's a point of confusion saying that the blue event and the pink event here cannot be compared. Okay? So even in Lamport's clock, these two events were independent events. So why is it that in vector clocks we can actually say something in Lamport's clock? Is that your question? Okay. So now we can just do the same algorithm and just overlay Lamport's clock values over the vector clock, right? So what is the Lamport's clock value? Wish we had a little more color here. Let's do brown. Okay. So So this Lampert's clock is 0, 1, 2. Here you have 0, 1. Okay. And then what goes over here as Lampert's clock will be 1 because that's what you will send. Okay, you will take 1. Your local clock is 1. Okay. So you will take the max of 1 and 1 is 1 and you increment. So here you will get a, or we can actually not confuse that. If this has advanced to 2, let's say this is 2. Okay, so you take max of 2, 1, which is 2, and then you get 3. So this is 4. Okay. So the brown values are same events or timestamp by Lampert's clock, and the vectors are what vector clocks. Okay, now your question is, although these two events are independent, what happened in Lampert's clock that prevented us from doing this observation? Okay, so now if I gave you the two timestamp, what's the timestamp of the pink event? 2. What's the timestamp of the blue event? Okay, in this case also 2. And I said now I give you two events that are timestamp 2 and 2. What can you tell me about them? Okay, by comparing them. Okay. The integers are same. Okay, just for simplicity, I'm just going to make it 1. Okay, so if I give you this set 2 and that is 1, and say now which one is greater? Okay, you'll say that's greater. So then I'll say, does that mean that that happened before, happened after that? Just by looking at this, could you tell me? If you say 2 is greater than 1, hence that has happened before, that's a wrong conclusion you are drawing, because looking at this picture, you should say they should not be comparable at all. But integers can always be compared. Okay, so what Lampert's clock is not allowing you to do is just take these two values, given any two values. I give you 2 and 4. Okay, you say which is greater? That one is greater. Does that mean that happened after that? As per this picture, no. As per what the clock values are telling you, yes. So Lampert's clock is not giving you the property you want. Okay. What Lampert's clock should have done, if it gave you that property, somehow these two should not be comparable at all, because they're independent. Okay. But because integers can be directly compared, and you can say which integer, that does not let you draw the conclusion you want. Then what we did is we defined this notion of a vector, that now whenever your concurrent event makes the clock values uncomparable. Okay, so then you say those are independent events. I can't say which one happened before, because neither of them is greater than the other. Okay. So is that clear again? What was the problem with Lampert's clock? Not that in Lampert's clock suddenly there was a happened before relationship. There was none. But looking at the integers, you could actually compare them, but that didn't let you draw any conclusions. Okay, yes.
Doesn't the space complexity increase with the number of processes?
Okay, does the space complexity increase the number of processes? Definitely does. If you have 1,000 processes, your clock value will have 1,000 integers. So that's the way it is. Vector clocks will have to keep more and more integers about more and more processes that are all part of some large group. Okay, so that is unfortunately.
We can still use the Lampert's clock if we have a list of messages that have been passed between processes, but that would involve a global memory which is not desirable.
Yeah, so we don't have global memory, we don't have global clocks. So you do have to do, unfortunately, sending of messages with clock values and so on. But yeah, I mean, if you have 10,000 processes, your clock will have 10,000 integers, which is rather large for a clock, but that's the way it is. Typically, this is used in smaller groups for a reason. In most cases, actually not used. People just say, I'm going to use NTP and I'm going to just timestamp, and that's the way it is. Okay? Sometimes you'll make wrong conclusions if two events happen very close to one another within the error tolerance of NTP. If you can live with that, then that's the easiest thing. And you don't have to bother about keeping. This an application has to keep track of. Okay? NTP is something that the OS takes care of. You don't do anything. You just say get time of day, it gives you time of day, you timestamp it, you're done. And that's all you need to do. Here you have to implement a library that's going to do all this extra, but it doesn't assume clock synchronization. Okay, so that's the way it is. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, so that's the picture that does the same thing, which I'm going to ignore for now. Okay, I'm going to talk about one more. So that's the second thing. So we talked about physical clock synchronization, Now we talked about logical clocks and logical clock synchronization. We saw two, logical clocks and vector clocks. Now we are going to talk about a third problem, okay, which is they are all somewhat independent, but we'll see now in many of these now we'll bring back vector clocks or logical clocks to solve some other problem, okay, as well. Okay. Third problem is referred to as global state. Okay. So I'm going to define what this means and why do we care about it. Okay. So now I'm going to first give you some examples. So let's say you have a system of n processes. Okay. Let's say you're doing a distributed simulation. Let's say you're doing some research. Research requires you to do some simulation experiment. The simulator is set up so that it's not a single process simulation, it's an n process simulation, and processes talk and they're simulating something. Okay. And let's say it's long running simulation, it takes 6 hours for it to finish, okay, because it has to do a lot of computation. Okay. And let's say at the end of somewhere in the middle, one process crashes. Okay, that's a 10 process, let's say it's a 10 process simulation, one process crashes 3 hours into the simulation. Okay. So clearly simulation cannot finish because all processes have to do their task in the larger simulation, but one process has crashed. Okay. So what do you do? The simplest thing is you kill all the processes, you terminate and restart. The simplest thing. Yes, something went wrong, some process crashed, restart everything. But as you can imagine, if you restart everything, you're throwing away all the work that has actually gone on thus far. Okay, 3 hours of time on that was spent by every process is completely wasted. You restarted from scratch. Okay. So what else could you do? The other thing you could do is periodically every process can somehow do what is referred to as a checkpoint, where it writes to disk whatever work it has, some intermediate results. Like this is what I have done, here is the current intermediate result. Okay. So now if a process crashes, rather than restarting from scratch, you restart all the processes, but don't have them start from the beginning. Let them load the intermediate result they wrote, and then you continue from that point on. Is that clear? What I said? Okay, so instead of starting from scratch, you have processes write some intermediate result to disk, which we'll call the state of that process. That's how much work it has accomplished. And if something goes wrong, rather than what is called rolling back all the way to the beginning, you roll back to the most recent checkpoint, which says I will load the most recent intermediate result and compute from that point on, so I don't waste all the work I have done so far. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. Okay? Is that clear? Now the problem is as follows. Okay? You want to take this intermediate checkpoint in some consistent way. Okay, so everybody starts on a consistent shape. When you start from the beginning, everything is consistent. Okay. What you don't want is you load some checkpoints that are not consistent with respect to one another. Okay. In particular, you want all the processes to take the checkpoint at the same time. So they are all at the same point in computation, and you start from that point on. Okay. So one way to do this is, let's say at the beginning of every hour, everyone freezes. Okay. At noon, all processes freeze. Okay, nothing is happening, so you checkpoint at noon, okay, continue. At 1 o'clock everything freezes, checkpoint, continue. Okay. So now you crash somewhere, you take the most recent checkpoint, everything was exactly taken at that point in time, and you continue. Okay. Then you have something that is consistent with respect to one. Okay. Is that clear? Okay, now what's the problem with doing it this way?
No global clock. You can't necessarily say when to close all the applications at the same time.
Okay. So we said that there is no global clock. Anytime I say everybody freezes at noon, that should raise a red flag, saying there is no such thing as noon that is perfectly synchronized on all machines. Okay. So if you had a perfectly synchronized clock, this would be a trivial problem. What I said works perfectly. Everybody freezes exactly at the same time. Okay. And you take a checkpoint and then you continue. Okay. But there is no such thing as a perfectly synchronized clock. So the noon, what noon says on your local clocks are slightly off. Okay. So what happens now is if you say everybody freeze at noon, with respect to real time, some machines are frozen at 11:59, others are frozen at 12:01. Okay, so you are basically at different points in your computation. Right? Because noon means one process freezes, it's not yet noon on the other freezes. So it has actually done some more work than this process. So they are all freezing at slightly different points in time. So this is going to be inconsistent. If you sort of load up that state, they are not frozen at the same time. Some processes have done little more work with respect to real time, some less. So you may get some inconsistencies. And I'll show you an example of what inconsistencies mean in this case. Okay. So now if you reload that state and continue, you will may get errors. Not always, but sometimes you will get errors, and I'll show examples of what this happens. Okay, so what you want is to capture what is referred to as a global state of a distributed system, which is you want to be able to capture the state of each process in a somewhat a consistent manner, so that you can reload. Okay? And the problem arises because there is no perfect clock synchronization problem so far. Okay? We don't know how to do it, it cannot be done. So this trivial thing saying everybody freeze every hour and do this is not going to work. Okay? So we'll now see how do you actually take a snapshot that is going to be consistent. For that we'll start with some terminology. Okay? So we'll define global state as the local state of each process, which is the memory state of every process, and messages that are in transit. Okay? Processes are exchanging message. So to capture the entire state of the system, you want to first capture the local state, which is the memory state of every process, whatever it has done, as well as messages that are in transit, messages that have been sent but not received somewhere in the network. You want to capture that state too. Because if you restart it and that message disappears, then something has gone wrong. Okay, in a real system, that message would have been received and processed. Okay. So when you want to restart a process, you want to restart its local state as well as messages in transit. Okay. The question is, how do you figure out the global state? Okay, we'll assume every process is independent, exchange messages. There is no global clock, and you want what is referred to as a distributed snapshot, which is a consistent global state. And now I'm going to show you what happens when you do not have perfectly synchronized clock and you freeze at slightly different points. Okay. For that, we will basically refer to what is called a consistent cut and an inconsistent cut. Okay. So that's timeline. X-axis is timeline. Each is showing three processes, P1, P2, P3. They're exchanging messages that are labeled M1, M2, and M3. Okay. And then there are dotted lines. Okay. Think of a dotted line as whenever a dotted line intersects a process, that is when the process takes its snapshot. That is when it says, I'm going to freeze, write my intermediate state to disk. Okay. And the question is, if suppose some process crashes and you restart the computation using the consistent cut, which means P3 starts from this point in time, P2 starts at that point in time, and P1 starts at that point in time, will that be consistent or inconsistent? In our perfectly synchronized clock algorithm, this dotted line will be completely vertical, because everybody freezes at exactly the same time. Because we do not have a perfect clock, processes are actually freezing at slightly different points in time because they don't know what noon is with respect to real noon. Okay, so you will basically have this scenario where this process thinks noon is that point in time, this process thinks is that point in time, that process thinks is that point in time. So they're still taking snapshot with whatever, whenever their clock says noon, but with respect to real time, they're all off with respect to one. Okay? So this is what will happen if you say freeze at noon and take a snapshot, because there is no perfectly synchronous clock, you're going to get this. So this is where you will start the computation. Question is, does that cause any errors or not? Okay? And the claim is, so there are two pictures shown here. Okay? So the claim is, if you use this snapshot, which or this cut, it will be consistent, but if you use this one, it is not consistent. Okay? And we'll ask why. So this is referred to as an inconsistent cut, this is referred to as a consistent cut. And why is it not consistent? Okay? So what we are going to do is, not only are we going to capture the state of each process at that point in time, we are also going to capture all the messages in transit. Okay? So we are going to take all the socket buffer queues and also capture them, as well as the memory state of the process. This is what we will refer to as a state. Okay? That's what we said. Global state is local state of each process, as well as your sort of send and receive socket queues. Those are all the messages that are in transit, haven't been processed or delivered to application. Okay? So if you capture that at those points in time, what may happen? So let's see, why is this inconsistent? Okay? you should see the reason it is inconsistent is you will see that there is a receipt of a process before the cut and there is a send of the process after the cut. Okay? Simply speaking, send always has to happen before the receipt. That should be clear. Okay? So now let's assume that P3 checkpointed here, P2 checkpointed here, P1 checkpointed there, and you restarted this processes at that point in time. What will happen? Okay? P2 starts from this point on. P2 is again going to compute here and send this message. Before the crash happened, the message M2 was already received and processed. P3 has checkpointed there. So after you restart, message M2 will get resent. It will get sent for a second time, re-delivered and reprocessed. Okay? So now you have a problem because that message has been sent and processed twice. Okay? That's going to result in inconsistency. That message could have simply been increment a counter. Okay? Counter got incremented twice, everything goes haywire because now you have some inconsistency. It should have been incremented only once. Okay? So if you have, since the whole reason this happened is you don't have an perfect lock. If you had a perfect lock, you would have a vertical line being your dotted line. This would never happen because that's an instantaneous point in time. Okay? Because you're checkpointing at slightly different points in time, now you have this scenario. So what you don't want is scenarios where the receipt of a message happens before the checkpoint, send in the timeline order is after, as a result there is 2 sends of the message. That you cannot happen. Okay. This is a consistent cut. Okay, because although there are messages crossing the dotted line, the send is always before and the receipt is after. That's not a problem. The reason it's not a problem is, okay, in this case, M3 has been sent. Okay? It was not received at the point of the cut. But we said we'll also capture socket buffer. So M3 is in transit somewhere. We also captured OS socket buffer. So M3 is sitting in some operating system's buffer. We have captured that. So when we restart, we'll restore that buffer. So M3 will still be in transit and it will be eventually delivered and processed. Not a problem. That's exactly what happens even in this case. Only it's delivered once, sent once, processed once. No problem. So consistent cut is one. So I will define it now, having given this intuitive explanation. A consistent cut is one where always sends of a messages. If a message happens to cross the dotted line, the cut, the send has to be on the left and the receipt has to be on the right. Okay? Or the message is entirely on the right or entirely on the left. That's not a problem. If the message crosses a cut, you don't want a scenario where the receipt of the message is before and the send is later causing, so that means the message was already received and processed. Now you are going to send it again and have it be processed again. That is a problem that you don't want to happen. Okay? So there are 2 properties we want. One property is you don't want to miss any messages either. If you hadn't captured OS socket buffers, all the messages in transit disappear. There's a send here. Okay? M3 has been sent, it's not been received. If you did not capture the socket buffer, M3 has disappeared. You restart, M3 was sent, it was never going to be resent, but it was not received. So you don't want a scenario where messages simply disappear. Right? You also don't want a scenario where messages are processed twice. Okay? That is this scenario. So you want to take a cut so that if you restart your application, all the processes, every message is always sent once, always received once, always sent, always received, never lost. Okay? If you do this, you have what is referred to as a distributed snapshot. You are capturing a global state of a system, okay, without any clock synchronization whatsoever. Okay? We will not assume any clock synchronization because there are no perfect clocks. We will throw out clock synchronization altogether. We see an algorithm that doesn't need it or doesn't depend on it. Okay? And yet it will give us that property. Okay? So that is what we will refer to as a distributed snapshot algorithm. I'm not sure that we have time to go through it and start talking about it, and then we will see. Okay? So what this is also doing is processes take their local snapshots at different points in time. They checkpoint their intermediate state at different points in time. Okay? So we want to do it in a consistent way. So I'm going to give us intuitive example of how to do this in a consistent way. Okay, so let's assume you are taking real snapshot, real pictures with the camera. Okay. Let's say you want to take a picture of the sky in a consistent way. Okay. Let's say there are birds flying around in the sky. Okay. but your camera's lens or field of view is such that you cannot take one snapshot and captures the entire sky. Okay? You are going to take multiple pictures, okay, and you are going to piece them together, and you want to then put them together and say this is the snapshot of the sky in a consistent way. Okay, so you'll take a picture of the left part, the middle part, the right part at slightly different points in time, because you can take one picture at a time. Okay? What's a consistent snapshot in this case? Okay? Because birds are flying around. Okay? So you want to capture, let's say, all the birds. Okay? So you want to make sure that in the collective pictures you take, okay, every bird that was in the sky is in at least one picture. You don't want to miss any birds. So you may take a picture here, there's a bird there. When you move there, if the bird has come here, the bird is not going to be in any picture. You miss something that you don't want. That's like a message disappearing somewhere. You also don't want a bird to appear in two pictures. Let's say you took a picture in the left part, there was a bird there. When you moved here, the bird flew and it's appeared in another picture. Now you have bird appearing in two pictures. That's also inconsistent. That's like a message that was appearing twice. Okay? So how do you take a picture of the sky so that every bird is in it, exactly one picture, no bird is missed? That captures the state of a sky. You can substitute clouds instead of birds, it doesn't matter. But that's what we mean by a consistent snapshot of the sky. Okay? Same thing here. How are you going to snapshot processes rather than birds in this case? Okay? So that's the basic idea. Now I can talk about this algorithm very quickly. We'll analyze it again later. Okay? As it turns out, the algorithm is actually very simple. Okay, so we'll draw some picture here. There's a picture here as well. So let's take three processes, A, B, and C. So we'll assume that any process can start the distributed snapshot. So it's time to take a snapshot just in case some process crashes, we reload from it. So let's say A starts the snapshot process. Okay. The way it does it is, it basically, let's say A has active TCP connections with some of the processes in the system. Doesn't matter, it doesn't need to have it with all, but A now, let's say, has a active TCP connection with B and C. Okay. So what A will do is basically it will send a message saying take snapshot. Okay. So A is first going to take its own snapshot and write it out to disk, that is local state, and it's going to say take a snapshot, send a take a snapshot message on the active TCP connection to B and C. Those are the ones that have message. When B and C, when each process receives a take snapshot message, it will take a local snapshot of its state, and it will send the same message to all its active TCP connection. Maybe B has TCP connection with two other processes and so on. So this is what each of them will do. In addition, since you have to also keep track of all the messages that are in transit, what happens is the first time you receive a take snapshot algorithm, you snapshot your local state, and all your incoming TCP connection, you start taking every message that's coming in and you write a copy of it to disk. That's your socket buffers. Right? You do that until you get a take snapshot message on that channel. So basically, you should realize that TCP connections are bidirectional. Okay? So when A takes a snapshot and it sends take snapshot messages, there are incoming messages from B and C. So it will start writing these out to disk. So this will go here, B will take its own snapshot and all of its outgoing messages, including the backward one, it will send a take snapshot message. Okay. So there will be a take snapshot message coming. So all the messages preceding that will get written. Okay. Once you receive this mark, which is referred to as a marker message, you stop recording. Okay, so I'm going to repeat what I just said. Any process can initiate a snapshot by writing its local state to disk. Okay, and sending what are called marker messages or on its outgoing TCP connections. Okay. And then you also take all your incoming TCP messages and start writing them to disk. Okay. You continue this until you receive a marker message on your incoming thing as well. That's saying stop recording. The first marker says start recording. The last marker says stop recording. And that's basically what the marker messages mean. Any process in the system, as soon as it receives the first marker message, starts recording, and it sends marker messages on its outgoing channels. Okay? And then it starts recording also, not only does it record its memory, it starts recording all its incoming messages as well until it receives a stop recording. Okay? That's the algorithm. Now, why does it capture consistent snapshot? Does it ever end? All that we have to discuss. But is it clear what the algorithm is? Very straightforward. No timing, nothing. Any process can initiate it by saying, let's take a snapshot, record your state, and tell everyone else to do the same thing by sending you essentially what is referred to as a marker message. Okay, so that's basically, you'll see this here. So that thing here, that box here is your memory state. These are all messages that are coming in. Okay, when a marker message comes on your incoming channel, first time you record your state, you send marker messages on outgoing channels, and you start recording any other incoming channel, you start recording the messages that are coming in until you receive markers. Okay, so that's the algorithm. Now, I don't have time because I ran out of time to tell you, first of all, why does it capture a distributed snapshot? Does it capture messages in transit? All that we'll study. Next, the final thing you want to say is, does this algorithm even stop? If these markers just keep circulating and never end? Okay, we need to make sure that the algorithm also ends. Okay, both of these things we'll talk about next time. Okay, so we'll just stop here.